I want to welcome you all back to Acquiring Aquinas, where we look at the articles of the Summa theologiae and really get into the nitty-gritty, you might say, of the basic fundamental perspective that Aquinas is presenting in each of these articles. And then we will see that there is a nice landscape that forms, really having to do with the critical points of view that Aquinas holds about all things, essentially, and how they impact his view about theology. We're looking at Article 4, Question 1 in Part 1, the Summa Theologiae, which asks the question, is sacred doctrine a speculative or practical science? So our main topic, our fundamental inquiry, and the answer that Aquinas gives in this article are as follows. The topic question is the nature and extent of sacred doctrine, really trying to get at what the scope of sacred doctrine is and what it's really all about. His article inquiry is sacred doctrine a speculative or practical science? And his answer is that sacred doctrine is a speculative science. But I want to provide a preliminary point here about terminology. The phrase speculative science may be confusing. Basically, speculative science is contrasted with practical science. Whereas practical science is knowledge obtained for the sake of some action or operation, speculative science is pursued for obtaining the knowledge itself. It is often thought of as the contemplation of some truth, or truth for its own sake. So we have two very interesting objection arguments that Aquinas presents. The first one is no investigation primarily ordered to action is a speculative science. Sacred doctrine is an investigation primarily ordered to action, thus no sacred doctrine is a speculative science, and that's contrary to the answer. So with respect to the major premise, Aquinas cites Aristotle here from the Metaphysics, Book 2, where he says that a practical science is that which ends in action. Now, of note here is that it is not that practical science doesn't involve reflection and planning, or even thinking about something, but the key thing about it is that the reflection and planning is done for the sake of doing something, or directing some kind of action. It's really why the thinking takes place in the first place. Now, in terms of the minor premise, that sacred doctrine is an investigation primarily ordered to action, Aquinas presents the objector's argument for this minor premise that it is clear that sacred doctrine is ordained to action. He refers to the Epistle of James 1:22 when it says that, quote, be ye doers of the word and not hearers only, end quote. This is a very telling passage from Scripture in conjunction with the idea of a practical science that I just described in the context of the major premise. Because this biblical passage implies that there is some kind of action that the word of sacred doctrine is ordered to, thereby identifying it as a practical science. Now, in terms of the second objection argument, the major premise is no thing primarily divided into types of law is a speculative science. Sacred doctrine is primarily divided into types of law, thus no sacred doctrine is a speculative science, and that also is contrary to Aquinas' ultimate answer. Now, the major premise, as this premise implies, the central feature of a consideration of law is how it is ordered to action. We are given law, that is, to shape and inform our actions and our behaviors. And so a consideration of law is not a speculative endeavor, but rather is a practical one. Now, the minor premise that sacred doctrine is primarily divided into types of law, the specific division that is being referred to in this argument in the context of sacred doctrine is the division of law into old and new law, the law of the Old Testament versus the law of the New Testament. It is argued here that this twofold law is a central consideration of sacred doctrine, just as the sacred scripture is broken down into the Old and New Testaments. Now on to the on the contrary or orienting argument. All practical sciences are that which principally deal with human operations. No sacred doctrine is that which principally deals with human operations. Thus, no sacred doctrine is a practical science. And then from that conclusion, we get the following two further implications. Namely, that sacred doctrine is a non-practical science, and then finally, sacred doctrine is a speculative science. And I'll talk a little bit about how we get some of these inferences that flow from the conclusion in a minute here. But first, let's look at the major premise. Here it is admitted that practical sciences are indeed chiefly dealing with human operations or actions. As Aquinas says, quote, as moral science is concerned with human acts and architecture with buildings, end quote. This is thus admitting the view of Aristotle about the nature of practical science versus that of speculative science. Now, in terms of the minor premise that no sacred doctrine is that which principally deals with human operations, this premise has the key word here, which we've seen Aquinas use in previous articles, regarding what sacred doctrine principally or chiefly deals with. So this word principally is important. So he's not saying that there isn't moral or practical outcomes that are to be of concern by those studying sacred doctrine. This is also, of course, of importance, but it isn't of chief importance. What is most important about sacred doctrine is learning truths about God, seeking to gain knowledge about God. Clearly, the emphasis here is on God rather than the practical outcomes such knowledge may have for us. We're doing something a little bit different with the conclusion of this argument. In order to show equivalence between the conclusion and the ultimate answer of the article listed at the top of this page, I worked on the conclusion a little bit. First, I obverted the conclusion, and when you obvert a proposition, you alter the quality of the premise and then take the class complement of the predicate. So you go from, in this case, you go from a negative quality proposition to a positive quality of the proposition, and then you take the predicate and you alter it to the class complement, so from practical to non-practical science. As you can see, this aversion amounts to saying the same thing as the conclusion. Then, assuming that science is fully divided into speculative and practical sciences, and that practical and speculative sciences are mutually exclusive, it follows that another way of saying non-practical science is just to say speculative science, insofar as these are synonyms. The best argument for the answer that Aquinas identifies for us, or presents, the major premise: all sciences that unify what belongs to other sciences and are not primarily concerned with human acts are speculative sciences. The minor premise: sacred doctrine is a science that unifies what belongs to other sciences and is not primarily concerned with human acts. Thus, sacred doctrine is a speculative science. This is a very standard argument form, the AAA1 argument form. First, it's noted with respect to the major premise that there is an and in this proposition, so there really are two things that need to be established in this single premise. The first is that all sciences that unify what belongs to other sciences are speculative sciences. And secondly, that all sciences that are not primarily concerned with human acts are speculative sciences. Note that the first idea, that the unifying science of other sciences, insofar as there is the unifying of other sciences by a science, isn't sufficient to show that sacred doctrine is a speculative science. Conceivably, there could be, let's say, a practical science that unifies other practical sciences. So only if both of these statements are true will the major premise be true and sufficiently get to his conclusion in a sound manner. With that in mind, in support of this major premise, Aquinas is bringing back into consideration a proposition he established in the reply to the second objection in the previous article, Article 4. There he argued that, quote, some investigations that treat of different philosophical sciences are one science, insofar as a higher science can unify a lower science by considering the objects of the subject matter of the other sciences according to a unified aspect, such as that which is revealed by God, which we talked about in the last article. This reference back can be easily seen where Aquinas suggests that a higher science, quote, extends to things which belong to different philosophical sciences because it considers in each the same formal aspect. What is implicit here, though, in support of this major premise, is that if some higher science unifies some science that is speculative, it will itself be speculative, even if it also unifies lower practical sciences as well. So one can see in this consideration of practical versus speculative sciences that there's a hierarchy between these types of sciences. Speculative science is more simple, whereas practical science adds the idea that it is knowledge that is put into practice, beyond merely attaining the knowledge. So it must be added here that a speculative science is not primarily concerned with human acts, due to the fact that a higher science that is speculative can unify and therefore include a lower practical science, but won't be principally about such practical acts. So some of this gets fleshed out in support for the minor premise, which deals specifically with the kind of speculative science that sacred doctrine is. So the minor premise, sacred doctrine is a science that unifies what belongs to other sciences and is not primarily concerned with human acts. So regarding this premise, Aquinas says, quote, "Sacred doctrine being one, extends to things which belong to different philosophical sciences, because it considers in each the same formal aspect, namely, so far as they can be known through divine revelation. Hence, although among the philosophical sciences one is speculative and another practical, nevertheless sacred doctrine includes both, as God, by one and the same science, knows both himself and his works. Still it is speculative rather than practical, because it is more concerned with divine things than with human acts, though it does treat even of these latter, insofar as man is ordained by them to the perfect knowledge of God, in which consists eternal bliss." End quote. So we can see that sacred doctrine is able to do double duty here. Its teachings definitely include guidance for human actions. The formal aspect through which it considers its subject matter is as revealed by God and conveys truths about God, which is knowledge to be obtained for its own sake, and so it is fundamentally a speculative science. So we spent a long time on Aquinas' best arguments section, and part of this is because he addresses the two objections in that section as well. In fact, this is something common with Aquinas. He'll often say that his main argument is sufficient to address the objections and then leaves it there. But we can gather what his criticism of the objection arguments would be. So with respect to the first objection argument, you'll recall that it is argued there in the minor premise that sacred doctrine is an investigation primarily ordered to action, and Aquinas rejects this in favor of sacred doctrine is not an investigation primarily ordered to action, and that contradicts this minor premise. So in this one he rejects this premise as false, since he shows that sacred doctrine is primarily concerned with truths about God as revealed. So with respect to the second objection, you'll recall once again that this minor premise of that second objection argument is that sacred doctrine is primarily divided into types of law, and he rejects this premise in favor of the idea that sacred doctrine is not primarily divided into types of law, which contradicts the minor premise. And he would reject the notion that sacred doctrine is primarily divided into types of law, even if this is a kind of important secondary consideration of sacred doctrine. It is not the primary task of sacred doctrine.